Okay, this is the first narrated PowerPoint for your American Family course. This is the PowerPoint slideshow that goes with the Chapter 1 for the textbook, the Think Marriages and Family textbook. What I want to encourage you to do when you go through these slideshows is to have your textbook in front of you, have the textbook open, and we'll kind of walk through the chapter with some of these. Some of the chapter slideshows will match some of the specific content in the chapter. Some of them will add some additional material. The objective, of course, is to help you learn important content that the chapter is introducing to you. You should also have your notes out so that you could be taking notes that you're learning and that you're thinking about while you're reading your chapter. Again, when you're in college, what we want you to do is not so much learn how to copy material down. That's really kind of low-level thinking. What we want you to learn how to do is to document and write down what you're thinking about. And so what I'll try to do as we're walking through some of these slides, and as I'm talking to you about some of the content and ideas here, is give you some cues as to what you should be writing down and what you should be thinking about, some questions you should be addressing and looking for more content in when you read the chapter a little bit more carefully. So in this first chapter, what we're doing is we're trying to figure out how do we define families nowadays, how do we construct and build families nowadays. That process has dramatically changed since probably the 1970s. And so let's kind of look at that and see how that works and how that doesn't work really very well in American society. The premise that I'm following in my study of families, and what I want you to think about when you look at families today, is the premise that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to build both an individual and then to build a larger society that we live in today if we don't have families that work. Human beings have to have other human beings to help them learn who they are, to help them figure out all the basics that they need to know and learn. Human beings aren't like some kinds of animal species that can have instincts that are in their DNA so that they know how to survive. Human beings have to have other human beings teach them how to survive. And so that's why families are just essential to teach us who we are and how we need to learn how to, the very basics about survival. And then even thriving. That's kind of what you're doing right now. You're working on a college degree so that you can thrive in the world. Think about all the things that you and I take for granted that we know how to do. We know how to sit down and feed ourselves. We know how to get dressed in the mornings. We know how to tie our shoe. We know how to interact with strangers in an elevator. We know all kinds of things that our families have taught us how to do. We kind of even have a sense of self-confidence, and we know we have skills and abilities that our families taught us how to do. Well, if we didn't have people who knew all of that, we wouldn't even have a society. Our society depends on families to teach members how to survive and how to be contributing members of society, how to get a job, how to be neighbors, how to be citizens. And so families are just crucial. They're just essential. And so that's kind of a larger question I want you to always be thinking about when you take this course. You're taking this course as part of a larger program in criminal justice. Most police who go out on calls and they involve some kind of crisis that's happened in a family. And so oftentimes families aren't working well. They're in a state of dysfunction. And so there's a crisis that's taking place. And so families need to learn how to function better, and we need to work together to help our families work better so that we don't have levels of crime and we don't have children trying to figure out how to survive in dysfunctional families and dysfunctional neighborhoods. So that's kind of where we're coming from with this kind of a class. So when we try to figure out how to define a family, what is a family? Who decides what that is? I've got a old-fashioned picture here. It's kind of a silly-looking picture. I stick this on here because I want you to think about the fact that some of the old-fashioned definitions of family really don't seem to work anymore. Because what's happening is that people are coming up with their own definitions of what families are. Sometimes that works, sometimes that really doesn't work. And so when you think about this larger question, what's the best way to define a family? What I wish you'd start writing down in your notes right now is some answers to some of these other sub-questions. Well, who gets to be in a family and who doesn't get to be in a family? When you think about family, who's in it and who's not in it? Think about your own family and your own family experience. Start writing down in your notes right now, well, who's included and who's not included? Does it have to be somebody who's related to you? Could it be just a really close friend? What are families supposed to do? That's what number 2 is about. When we say the function of a family, what we mean is when we put a family together, when we decide to define a family, do we use a definition that's based on what families are supposed to do? What's their job description? So maybe you should write down in your notes right now, what is it that families are supposed to do? What's their job description? And if families aren't doing that, what kinds of problems occur because they're not fulfilling their basic job description? If you're going to start a family, what is it that you think are the basic job descriptions? If you're going to find somebody to start a family with, what is it that you'd write down on their job description? Number 3 is kind of the opposite of number 2. If families aren't working, what is it they're not doing? What's the dysfunction sometimes that families do? Are families supposed to provide for economic resources? If nobody in the family is working, is that going to be a dysfunction for the family? If they can't pay their bills, if they can't feed and clothe their children, is that a dysfunction of the family? What other dysfunctions can you think of? Maybe some things that maybe you've experienced or you've seen friends of yours experience when their families weren't working really very well. If you're going to approach a career in a criminal justice field, oftentimes dysfunctions are what you run into. You run into crime and violence that happens in families, abuse. You run into spousal abuse. You run into child abuse problems that happen in families. Drug abuse, substance abuse that causes all kinds of problems within families. Number 4 is kind of interesting because it's kind of the opposite of 2 and 3. Sometimes families, they're not necessarily functioning. They're not necessarily doing something wrong, like a dysfunction. They're just not functioning at all. They're just not there. And families aren't doing, it's not that they're doing something bad. It's not that they're doing something right. They're not doing something wrong. They're just not doing anything at all. They're just not functioning well. And that can pose problems as well. People grow up and their families just didn't teach them what they needed to know. They just weren't there. And so oftentimes today we find, and we're going to study this at the end of the semester, we find a problem called fatherlessness, and fathers aren't there. And we find that children don't learn and don't have essential experiences that they get from their fathers. That they need to have from having 2 parents that are there. And most children today don't grow up with both parents there. And we'll look at some of those numbers and see what that looks like. So number 5 is about how have families changed? How has the definition of families changed? And how has the composition of families changed over time? Certainly over the 20th century, since World War II, how has that changed? Now, I've got some numbers here to show you, some census numbers to show you how has the composition of families, who's in a family, who's not in a family, how has divorce changed families, how has cohabitation changed, how has the number of people in family, siblings, people living together, how has all that changed what we call what's in a family and what's not in a family? So these are questions. Write those down in your notes and start thinking about it. Start thinking about answers to these kinds of questions these days. These are questions that everybody thinks about and everybody writes down and wonders about as they're thinking about their own family and what constitutes a family today. Again, I've got another picture of a family from the 70s here, kind of an old-fashioned picture, just to kind of get us thinking about what's happened to families. I put the year 1970 on here because it seems like since the 70s we've been experiencing dramatic shifts in families, decade shifts. We take a census in the United States, a literal count of everybody in the United States every 10 years. The Constitution asks us to do this so that we can count the number of citizens in each state so that we can determine how many representatives every state gets in the House of Representatives. So we have to count everybody. Well, when we're counting citizens, we're also counting all kinds of other information, collecting all kinds of other information while we're out there doing that. And some of the information we find out about is about families. And so I have some family information, household information that I can show you that helps us understand some more about who's in a family and how that has changed over time, certainly since the 70s. Let me show you that in just a second here. So this is a chart from the U.S. Census Bureau, and look across the top of it, and it shows you census material. Look at the decades, 70, 80, 90, and then we start to do some other kinds of data collection. It's not necessarily a census, but it's other data that's survey material that's not 95, 2005, 2012. Those aren't census material, but they're survey material. The ones that are done on the decades are census material, and it's a household. So what we're doing is we're getting information based on addresses, and so a household is an address. And so we would go to a household and we would ask people to tell us who's living in that household. And so you read down the chart here and you find out the categories of people. So on the left-hand side, you see other, women alone, men alone, other family member, married couple without children, and a married couple with children. And so what I wanted you to see here, the first thing I want you to see, I put it in yellow there. In 1970, 40% of all households in America were composed of a married couple with children. And then what I want you to see is the dramatic change in 2012. That's the last time I have this information. That number has reduced by almost half, by more than half. Only 19.6% of households were a married couple with children. So that's a dramatic change in households, married couple with children. So you want to ask yourself, well, where did those people go? Where are the who's living in the households, and where did they go? They used to be married couple with children. Where are they now? Well, look across the numbers and let's see where they may have changed. The married couple without children, that's remained pretty much the same. The 30% in 1970, 29% in 2012. That number really hasn't changed much. other family member, that one has increased. When we take a census like this, the census taker does not fill the form out. The person living in the household gets to fill it out. And so the person gets to define what they mean by the category other family member. And so this is probably living with you've got children, maybe living with grandparents, maybe living with other relatives in the house. And so that's what other family members mean. You're not living with your biological parents. You're living with somebody else in the family that you're related to. That number has increased. Men living by themselves. That number has dramatically increased. Look at that. Women living by themselves. That one hasn't dramatically increased, but it has increased. Women living by themselves. Those numbers have increased, certainly the women by themselves, because women since the 70s have been waiting longer to have children and waiting longer to start their family. So in 1970, when we take the census, we have smaller numbers of women by themselves because they're getting married earlier and probably going to college and waiting and starting a career. Less are doing that in 1970. More are doing that in 2012. And then look at the other category. The other category is just a catch-all for everybody who didn't fit into one of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 categories below it. And that number has dramatically increased. Look at that. So there are all kinds of other definitions of what's in a family. Look at that. That doesn't fit into the category of married couple with children by 2012. It has changed dramatically in your lifetime, certainly in your lifetime. When you look at a chart like this, you'll see things like this in classes that you take. You'll see things like this in a textbook, let's say. What you want to do is you want to not just look at a chart and then just skip over it. You want to look at a chart like this, and you want to write down in your notes some facts off of the chart in a sentence so that you're getting information from the chart. The chart has lots of information on it. What you want to do is develop the habit of looking at information that's contained in a chart and then write down 3 or 4 facts off of it in a sentence form so that you're learning information from the chart. So, for instance, between 1970 and 2012, the number of married couples with children was reduced by half. There's a sentence right there. And so look at the chart and come up with some sentences that you can write down, and that way you've got some facts that you can recite very quickly and learn from a chart like this. Okay, here's 2 more new pieces of information. The census material I just gave you is not in your textbook. This information here is from the Pew Research Center. It contains, the Pew Research Center collects all kinds of information about what's going on in America. It's a great resource for you if you're looking for social research in America, for papers that you're writing, for all kinds of other classes that you might be taking. I wanted you to see, look at the right-hand side. Half of U.S. adults today are married. See how that's declining since 1960, 2016. We are waiting longer to get married is what's happening. We're going to college. Women specifically are going to college now. They weren't in 1960 at the rate they are now, and they're waiting to get married longer. I need to go to college. I need to start my career, and then I'll get married. And so what's happening is we're getting married at a later date, a later age in our life, and we're having fewer children because our biological window is getting smaller. And so in 1960, we were getting married younger, we were having more children, and we weren't having 2 careers. Well, in 2016, that's different. We're getting married later. We are having 2 careers, and we are getting married later and having less children. It's a very different world in 2016 than it was in 1960. What I wanted to show you in the chart on the left-hand side is that there's an education gap. Look at 1990 and 2015. This is the information, the span of time that this chart is showing us. People who are age 25 and older and who are married based on education. So people who are have a bachelor's degree, that's the top bar, the dark green bar. People who have a bachelor's degree are getting married and in 1990, and they're still getting married in 2015. People who have high school or less, that's the bottom bar, the gold-colored bar. In 1990, 63% were getting married. In 2015, only 50% were getting married. So what's happening is you see how the dark green bar and the gold-colored bar, you see how those two bars over time are getting wider apart. Well, what's happening is that there's a gap that's starting to widen between education and between people who are getting married. So people who are having less education are not getting married as much as they used to get married. So there's a gap happening, an education gap that's happening, and it's continuing to grow. Not between people who are getting a college degree. That's you. You're getting a college degree right now. But people who have high school or less, who don't finish high school or just have high school, they are getting married in declining rates. They are living together. Most people are living together now, but they're getting together at higher rates than people who have a college degree. It's harder to get married because you can't make as much money because you only have a high school diploma. And so it's harder and harder to happen. It's not because people in high school don't want to get married. It's because people who just have a high school degree can't make enough money is what the problem is. It's an economic problem is what's going on here. It's a terrible economic problem that's going on. So we'll look more at this as the course continues. But I just wanted you to see this and maybe write down in your notes, do you know anybody that you went to high school with who just stopped there? Do you know anybody who's struggling economically right now to get a job because they didn't go to college or are having to drop out of college because they can't pay the bills? But write down some notes to yourself here. That's a problem. Okay, here is another new idea here. This is a guy, look at the guy on the right. This is a guy named C. Wright Mills. And he's a sociologist, and he invented this term called the sociological imagination. In fact, that's a title of a book that he wrote. And the idea he's introducing to us here is that you and I don't just experience our own personal problems. Sometimes the problems that we experience are social problems. They're bigger problems. They're problems that all of us experience. And so the question I'm asking you here in this slide is, if fewer people are getting married today in America, does that cause problems for all of us? In other words, is it just my own personal decision to not get married or to wait to get married or to cohabit? Is that just my personal decision and it doesn't affect anybody else? Or if more and more and more people decide not to get married or to put off getting married till later or to cohabit, is that going to cause problems for everybody in the society? Is it a social problem? That's the question I'm asking you to think about. So let me throw these number 1 through 8 out to you. If your children are raised without a connection to larger family, if all of our children are raised without connections to larger extended families because we've decided not to get married, we've decided not to connect with a larger extended family, and so they don't have connections to what we call a family capital, that kind of hurts everybody. Does that make sense to you? If we're just having our own private experience of family and not connecting our children to cousins and to grandparents and to aunts and uncles, it ends up kind of harming our children in the resources that they have connection to. It's also going to cost us more when it comes to educating our children later on. It's harder and harder. Think about those people in that chart earlier who don't go to college because they don't finish high school or they just finished high school. It costs so much more for them to go to college because not just the money to pay for college, but they don't have anybody in their family who went to college who can help them learn how to get into college, learn how to figure out how to do college. They don't have that connection with people. The cost of living is even more for people who don't have a connection to a larger family. They don't have resources. They don't have people that they can live with. They don't have people who can help them out. They don't have people who can help them, lend them a car. They don't have people who can help them get an interview, get a job. They don't have somebody who can connect them with somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who can get them an interview somewhere. Something you'll be studying in a criminal justice program is juvenile delinquency and crime. When you don't have a father, when you don't have males in the family, the chances of getting involved in juvenile delinquency and crime are dramatically increased. We'll study that at the end of the semester. With a broken family and with divorce and with step parents and with single parents, the health and welfare of children declines. Higher levels of loneliness, lower levels of physical health decline. Children who are raised in single-parent families have poor health. Insurance rates for all of us increase when there are higher levels of broken families, single families, higher levels of juvenile delinquency and crime in a neighborhood. All of our insurance, all of our home insurance goes up. The point of this slide is just to show you that family problems, having families that are in decline, having families that are fragmented, is not just a personal problem or not just a personal private issue that someone in your neighborhood or a cousin of yours has. It's a problem that all of us experience and that all of us struggle with. Our whole state, our whole country, our whole city has to struggle with those problems and work together to try to solve those problems. We don't live by ourselves. We don't function and live on an island somewhere. We're all together in this. And so we all need to work together to find ways to survive in a healthier way. And having a family is one of the best ways to survive and to be healthy. And to not have a family, to be selfish and to, cut and run is kind of a disastrous way for me and disastrous way for my children. We're going to study that this semester. I'm kind of setting it up for you, but I want you to know that's kind of how the course is oriented. Okay, that's using the sociological imagination helps you kind of think about this. And think beyond yourself and think beyond your family and think beyond your own personal problems and think about, hey, this is a bigger problem that we're all going through, we're all dealing with. Look, this is a quote from C. Wright Mills. Neither the life of an individual, your own problems, your own personal issues, nor the history of a society, the story of what's going on in Houston, the story of what's happening, in your neighborhood. You can't understand either one of those unless you put them together. So we can't really understand what's going on in our story, in our life, in my neighborhood, in my house. And I can't really understand what's going on in Houston, in Texas, in the United States, unless I put those two stories together. And that's what classes like this are supposed to help you be able to do, is to put them together and help you make sense of the world and help you make sense of the life you're trying to live. And so, I know you're taking a class, and this is just a class online that you're taking, but I want it to be more than just a class you're taking. The object here is to learn more about life and learn more about your life, and use this content and this material to help you be a better person, a better citizen, a better mother, a better father, a better aunt, a better uncle, a better person in the world today. Somebody who's out there in the criminal justice system one day, who's helping people survive, and use this material, use this knowledge to be a wise person, help people make really good decisions in life. So that's what this is all about.